Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm a scholar of colonial Latin America, and my work deals with the written texts that resulted from early modern maritime voyages and piracy. And in particular, what I'm interested in is the process of producing modern editions of manuscripts or overlooked print volumes from that time period. So what I want to talk to you about today is a model for approaching that type of edition electronically with an eye to maximizing the degree of transparency that you can build into the finished product. I'm going to talk to you about how I came to this idea, how I attempted to implement it recently, and reflect a little bit on why I think this is potentially a useful model for scholars in the humanities. My doctoral dissertation was I don't know how to use was an edition of manuscript history of piracy from 1693, and I spent a lot of time in the archive in New York where the manuscript is located, transcribing the text and then proofreading my transcription. Once that was done, when the day came to start my actual edition, I made a copy of the file and started my work in that file. Eventually I published the edition as a book, but the transcription, on which I spent probably hundreds of hours, is still just sitting on my computer. I could put it online somewhere, but I think even if I did, it exists at some conceptual and physical distance from the finished product. And that bothers me because it was a lot of work, and because I think it has value, and because I think there's a value in having the two things together. And so in the next editorial project that I did, I was able to remedy that problem somewhat. I did an edition earlier this year of a text by the same author, a much shorter text, for the journal Scholarly Editing, which is the annual of the Association for Documentary Editing. You're looking at this is a screenshot of their website. This is my introduction. This is the transcription. In other words, it's my attempt to represent the manuscript page as it reads on the manuscript page as closely as possible. This edition also includes the actual manuscript images, so you can look at my transcription and compare it to the manuscript image. And then this is my modernized version. What's interesting to me is not just that these two things are on the same website, but actually I was able to make them be one thing. In other words, it's not just one file, which is the transcription, and another file, which is the modern edition, but they're actually one file there. They exist simultaneously. The way that I was able to do that, I'm shy to show you code, but I think it will help me explain what I'm talking about. This project, like almost every project in the digital humanities today, was done using TEI-XML. If you're not familiar with that, TEI is the Textual Encoding Initiative. It's the de facto standard for digitizing texts. Well, not for digitizing, for encoding digital texts in the humanities worldwide today. It's an implementation of XML, which is extensible markup language, which you probably all know, but it's a language that's used to describe the content of information, as opposed to HTML, which is used to describe appearance. XML talks about content, what things mean. And so, built into TEI-XML are certain features that allowed me to encode the two things together. So what I'm showing you here are the first few words of the document. And I'm showing you here this choice element, which is a TEI-XML element, which allows me to indicate the original spelling of a word, and then you can see my modernized spelling. In another example, I'm inserting some punctuation into my modernized edition, which isn't in the transcription. Here again, I am modernizing spelling, and here I am expanding an abbreviation. So in other words, the original version and my modernized version exist together. They're one thing. So that when you're looking at, when you're looking at these two versions, this one and this one, you're looking at two views of the same file, filtered differently. I think that these examples I've shown you are pretty mechanical things, but there are other examples of decisions that were made in the process both of transcribing the text and modernizing it that I think show a higher degree of editorial intervention. So I'll show you a few examples. This is some text. Again, I'm using that choice element. This is some text that's in the transcription. I transcribed it. It's in the manuscript. But my view is that it's actually not part of the text. It's extraneous in some way. And so I'm eliminating it from the modernized version. Here is another example of something that's been overwritten in the manuscript. So I've done my best to read it, but it's smudgy. And so I'm indicating here that it's unclear. I'm giving a reason for why, and I'm indicating my certainty about that, which is medium. I'm fairly confident, but not, I wouldn't put any money on it. Here's a case of where the way this manuscript is bound, you can, on the backs of the pages, you can't see a lot of letters because they're in the binding. There's nothing that can be done. So basically I had to just deduce what those letters are. Here's a case where I'm not so sure. I've added a few letters to complete a word, but it could be other words. So I've indicated my certainty is low. And here's a case where this manuscript is a draft. So it's really messy. There's stuff written into the margins. And often the stuff that's written into the margins, there's no indication by the author of where it goes, and there are several viable possibilities. So this is one of those. I've added this, I'm indicating that this is added text, and the type is no caret, meaning there's no authorial insertion mark to tell me where to put it. In other words, basically this is my intervention in the text. So again, my goal was just to not toss out the transcription, to keep the two things together. But once I had encoded the transcription and the modernization this way, I realized that I had something more. I had actually built a scaffolding of information that takes you from the manuscript image to the transcription and walks you from the transcription to the modernized version. You can trace every decision back to the actual manuscript page. And I thought, if I have that information, then I should share it. I should build it into the actual edition. So working with the editors of the journal, we came up with some visual clues to let the user know what's going on. You can't really see it here, but this N is red. This is one of those letters that's on the back side of the page that I had to guess about. This is one of those insertions. There's no caret mark here, so that means that this was my decision about where this went. You're looking at the transcription here. I think more importantly, when you look at the modernized version, we built this system of color coding, which you can turn on. You don't see this by default, but you can turn it on, and it shows you my expanded abbreviations, my regularized spelling, the text I corrected. In other words, when I thought there was an evident error in the manuscript that I corrected, text that I supplied. And so I think that if you have any experience with this sort of thing, or even if you don't, probably the first question you might ask is, isn't this really excessive? And it is. This was a ton of work to edit this text this way. I mean, when you edit a text, you do all of these things anyway, but what you don't do is document every decision, many of them being decisions that you could easily stipulate in your criteria. You know, I'm going to put accent marks according to standard usage, right? You don't have to code every one of those things. But what I was interested in doing this, but why I did it this way, is I think there are two things that this points to. The first, I think, has to do with a cognitive process that, as editors, I'm not sure that we reflect on enough, which is that, are we really aware, you know, we lay out editorial criteria in our introductions, but do we really follow them? And if we have to document every decision we make, do we suddenly start to see that we're making decisions we previously didn't realize we were making? But what I want to emphasize today is that I think that this model of editing can speak to a few problems that textual editing has today. I think it's no secret that in the second half of the 20th century, the process of editing texts, which was the backbone of the humanities for centuries, really became seen as kind of an old man, kind of your grandpa's quaint hobby, faced with the rise of the importance of theory in literary criticism. I think in recent decades that's changed somewhat because of the possibilities that electronic editing have opened up for the ways that we read texts, the way that we transmit them, and the ways that we think about them. But, this was convenient actually that my presentation followed the previous one, because the gentleman before me talked about big data in the context of the world of finance. Humanities scholars have also been caught up in the frenzy of big data with the mass digitization of books by Google and by other people. Suddenly humanities scholars have at their fingertips vast quantities of information, and rightly so. There are a lot of projects today that are looking at that information, not unlike the way the gentlemen before me are looking at financial information. In other words, seeing texts as repositories of discrete bits of information that we can query to come up with all sorts of interesting and innovative conclusions. But if that's the mindset with which you're approaching humanities scholarship, it's easy to start seeing little data as irrelevant, quaint, even inefficient. In other words, the notion of sitting down and maybe one scholar or a small group of scholars and spending months or years laboring over commas and spelling and it doesn't seem like it's really pointing to the larger goal of where humanities scholarship is heading. So I think that even electronic textual scholarship is seeing itself marginalized today. I think also we have to think about the place of electronic editions on the web, which I think is inherently hostile to this sort of work. I think the ethos of the web is a place where information is democratic, where it moves freely, where it's non-hierarchical, where users create content. Those things are all really at odds with the notion of a professor somewhere who's an expert in something, who's the learned, anointed gatekeeper of a set of information. I think, however, that theory may be just self-flattery, because what's really more likely is that we're just in a climate where most of us, and I think we're all guilty of this, are fairly uncritical about things we read on the web. In other words, do we always ask the question, who produced this text? How is it produced? With what criteria? Who's responsible for it? If there's something wrong with it, who can we hold accountable? I think that this type of editing, though it may be impractical in a lot of circumstances, points to a possibility to remedy those two problems. I think in the first place, it shows that texts are not innocent. If you just look at this, this is one paragraph. You can't see all the color coding here, but nearly every word is touched. And this is, these are a few words of 40,000 words, say, in this fairly short text. They're not neutral, that we can't accept texts at their face value. Either tens of thousands of decisions were made or they were not made. But in either case, there's a human hand either present, or if what we're looking at is just a raw OCR, not present. But that there is a role for scholarly editing and producing high-quality texts for consumption on the web. I think also this can present a model of the editor which perhaps is more in line with modern expectations. I think when we think of scholarly editors, we do think of, senior scholars who have esteem and category and make decisions without necessarily having to explain them. Whereas I think in this model, I don't know how we see the editor as an accountant or as a programmer, but it's somebody who's accountable for their decisions. Because basically I'm giving away everything that I've done. If I've made mistakes, anybody can find them, right? There's no magic to this. I think also another feature that this type of editing can offer is that provided I've done it well, that I've transcribed accurately, and that I have indeed documented my decisions, I think in 100 years' time, provided TEI is still an intelligible standard, someone could evaluate this edition and its quality in the same way that they could today. In other words, you can look at my logic and decide if it's valid. Was he making good decisions? And in 100 years' time, decide, can we still use this, or does it need to be updated? And if it needs to be updated, you have my file, you have my transcription. You can compare it again to the manuscripts to make sure that it's right, but you have that as a starting point. It's a stretch, I know, but what I would propose is that this is something for textual editing, something akin to the open source model for programming. In other words, the idea is that you don't just distribute a compiled executable file, but you give away the source code. Here I'm not just distributing the final modernized edition, but I'm giving away everything that I used to create it. I think it's an idea that perhaps holds value for scholars in the digital humanities going forward. Thank you.